Anyways, I wanted to move on to something that I've been kind of looking at for a while, and it's kind of fascinated me. And it's kind of centered around this conversation about how do you deal with a country or a leader that's kind of become an international pariah. It's also kind of centered around what happens when a world leader isn't held accountable. And even though he is a pariah or a war criminal, he slowly makes his way back onto the world stage. In this case, I'm talking about Bashar al Assad, who is truly, in my opinion, a piece of human garbage and a war criminal. At this time, worse than Putin, worse than any other ones I can think of in at least the modern context. Just a refresher for those who maybe don't know much about Assad or have tried to forget. Assad's family has been ruling Syria for quite a while. He succeeded his father, who was also the ruler of Syria. And Assad has an interesting beginning. Bashar al Assad, that is, the current president of Syria. He was actually a doctor, went to medical school, and was an army doctor who also worked in the West, studied in the West. Is quite an articulate and fascinating guy if you actually watch an interview with him. He does not look like someone who would be a war criminal, to be completely honest. He's very cold and meticulous, though, and that may actually summarize some of why he's such a piece of garbage, like I said. So, after time being an army doctor working in the West, he was eventually called back to work for his family's regime, and in, I think it was 2000, became the 19th president of Syria. And Syria is a lot like Iraq and a lot of other countries in that area, where there's a lot of sectarianism and a lot of ethnic and religious conflicts. And he's one of these guys, his family was just, like his father was just like him, that has a strong hand and tries to be the glue that keeps the country together through whatever means. And Assad at first was actually seen as a reformer by a lot of political scientists. And unfortunately, though, as time went on, the Syrian Civil War was basically stoking under his rule, and he used the guise of stopping terrorism to basically create a police state and indiscriminately kill civilians. The United States, the European Union, and the majority of the Arab League have called for Assad's resignation from the presidency even as far back as 2011, after he ordered a violent crackdown on the Arab Spring. So this all kind of really began with the Arab Spring. People just wanted some semblance of a democracy, right? And so his crackdown on protests in parts of the country led to what we now know as the Syrian Civil War, right? Which obviously got very badly out of control. And I talked about it a few weeks ago. Eventually you had actors like Russia and the Wagner Group actually coming in. Aleppo was a major Russian indiscriminate bombing of civilians. Damascus has been completely changed. The entire country is just, unfortunately, not even a close image of what it used to be. And for all the history and culture there, it's really sad. But this guy pretty much did everything possible to ruin a population. To ruin a population, including bombings, chemical weapons, torture, violent massacres, and in a sense, much like Putin, like I said earlier, he used the guise of fighting terrorism to crack down on opposition and human rights. Think of Putin in Chechnya, but even worse. This guy's just bad news. Like that's the main takeaway, if you had to have any from what we're talking about here. But the reason I bring this guy up, and I do encourage you to look more into him, because it's actually surprising that he's still alive, for one thing. Because the Syrian Civil War, from numbers I've seen, about half of Syria's population has been displaced, either internally or externally. And it's always surprising when guys like him are still going. We obviously don't hear as much about him recently, but he's still there, he's still doing things. It's just the world, sadly, has moved on. And, I talked a few weeks ago about that's one of the refugee migrant crises that is still happening and still really not covered very much. But again, the reason I bring up this guy today is because I was surprised to see that he's actually kind of doing a comeback tour on the world stage. Like I mentioned, he's been a pariah in the eyes of most of the world, or at least countries with some semblance of ethics. Yet, I actually read today in Axios, and then The Economist, that the Biden administration is quite furious and caught off guard because last Friday, the Syrian President Bashar al Assad visited the UAE, the United Arab Emirates. And this day was, I think it was March 18th, I want to say, and it was horribly symbolic. Not only because Assad, who worked with Putin to help bomb Syrian cities, as we know, is now, kind of coming out of the woodworks while Russia's invading Ukraine. That was one reason why it was atrocious. But also because apparently the day they met, which was March 18th, like I said, was the 11th anniversary of the first Friday protest in the southern city of Daraa, which is a date that a lot of Syrians and international policy experts see as the start of the revolution and subsequently the Syrian Civil War. And so that's kind of a bad day for him to come out of the woodworks, let's be honest. And also, this was a fairly big deal that has gone somewhat unnoticed because this was the first. This was his first visit to an Arab country since the Syrian war erupted 11 years ago. And apparently this infuriated the U.S. and other Western countries because the U.S. and the UAE already have a very strained relationship after some UN Security Council issues and just clashes over what you label as a pariah state, let's just say. And I'll get into that a little bit later. But according to the coverage of these events, Assad arrived in Abu Dhabi on Friday, and he met with the Crown Prince, who's Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed, who we're going to call MBZ because it makes my life easier. And he also met with the ruler of Dubai, Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum. And the MBZ guy from the UAE also is reported to have briefed Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett and Egypt's Prime Minister Fattah al-Sisi about Assad's visit. And it's just interesting to see this network of conversation going on amongst all these Gulf actors, right? And yeah, anyways, we'll continue because it just makes me mad just reading it. But apparently the Biden administration is just furious about this, like I already mentioned. And the State Department spokesman Ned Price said in quotes here that Assad remains responsible and accountable for the death and suffering of countless Syrians, the displacement of more than half of the pre-war Syrian population, and the arbitrary detention and disappearance of over 150,000 Syrian men, women, and children. And obviously that is all true. And this is why it worries me, because Assad is at least being given an audience again by people that the U.S. apparently does do trade with, apparently gets oil from, and it really has to tell you a lot about the difference in values. And, I'm not some who says we can't work with people like this, but it really does tell you there is a significant difference in values here. And it also tells me this guy hasn't been held accountable. Axios also mentions that an Emirati official has pushed back, which of course they will. They've pushed back and basically told the West that Assad's visit was part of a new, broader strategy of talking to everyone in the region and trying to have no enemies, which, yeah, I get it. But and the Emirati official also said that, in quotes, their new approach emphasizes diplomacy, de-escalation, and engagement. And we put our own interests first. I would say cancel out the first three and just say they put their own interests first. Because, like I've talked about, a lot of these Gulf states, we could think of a few like Saudi Arabia. They've been involved in some very bad conflicts as well. And the UAE has definitely a stake in the game with the Assad regime. So I don't know if actually peace and de-escalation is what they're looking for. I think it's just securing their own interests and really not caring about what anyone else has to say. And to add more context to this, because I think this actually may understand, A, why the Biden regime is angry, and B, why the UAE feels good to talk with Assad right now, is that if you guys remember earlier this month, there were multiple countries that abstained from that UN Security Council vote that wanted to condemn the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And the UAE was one of the countries that abstained. The article in The Economist from this week, which is called Springtime for Bashar, Syria's outcast dictator returns to the Arab world. And it goes into more detail on this just problematic relationship. The article just talks about how before this meeting, Assad had really only been to Russia and Iran since 2011. It kind of makes a side joke about how he really never had to pull out his passport or dust it off because he wasn't really welcome anywhere. But this article also notes that this is not particularly shocking because apparently the UAE has actually been slowly warming relations with Syria for quite a while. They even opened their embassy back in Syria in 2018. And so this does make you understand now why they did not vote to condemn Russia involving Ukraine. Because when I think of Syria, they are somewhat of a package deal with Russia. Just because we have to remember that like Putin's regime got to really try out some of their indiscriminate bombings in towns like Aleppo. And Assad clearly was fine with that. He allowed the Wagner Group and other ones to be completely involved in Syria. So now we understand, because the UAE has a stake in the game. Moving on in this article, it also notes that this is kind of an interesting and probably worrying sign if you're the United States, that the Gulf states may not really value American influence or American perspectives like they used to. And it also may show that, they're quite fine with breaking away from the West. The article also points out that the U.S. is kind of seen as being incoherent. What I mean there is U.S. foreign policy is seen as being quite incoherent. And when you look at the list The Economist gives us here, it makes sense. The article mentions in quotes here, the U.S. wanted Mr. Assad gone, but allowed him to stay. Its Iran policy does an about-face every 4 years. President Joe Biden vowed to make Saudi Arabia a pariah state until he needed its help to lower oil prices. Both the Saudi and Emirati crown princes now duck his phone calls. And I mean, I think this article is not being completely fair to put it on completely on Biden. This is an issue, I think, in the United States, and kind of one of the issues that democracies have. Like, believe me, I'm very pro-democracy. I'm not trying to say that. But when you have elections every 4 years, it makes foreign policy very unstable. And, that can work sometimes in domestic policy because the populace at least is voting for something that may or may not impact them. But the global order, in some sense, needs stability. And so I don't know if the electoral system, the way we have it, is good for foreign policy, which obviously is not the key concern of American people. But it should be at least considered important. And that's why I'm kind of a fan of what some would call the deep state, but I would just call the establishment and the bureaucratic institutions that we have, in which we have people that are not connected to policy working in these fields. Because it's true, the U.S. has lost a lot of clout. I mean, Trump is definitely part of that, pulling us out of the Iran deal. And I also think, and this is just one of my theories here, is that the Abraham Accords that Trump was very key in signing before he left office, it kind of emboldened the Gulf states. It kind of gave them a sense of strength and autonomy in that region. And I do wonder if this extra strength has kind of allowed them to, A, talk to Assad again, but also feel like they can kind of stand up to Biden. That's just my theory, but either way, it's not good because we're seeing that pariah states are still able to come back on the world stage, and that the U.S. is really losing respect. And, the elephant in the room is, and I should probably do a long episode on it at some point, is just Saudi Arabia. Because this regime has no shared interest with us other than money. I mean, that's the only one I can think of. And, we've been drawn into a Yemen crisis just to help them because we need their oil and they need our guns. But, during this Ukraine-Russia crisis, they can't even pick up the phone to help us. So, yeah, the whole thing is just disgusting. And, I'm fine if we start to separate and distance ourselves from some of these actors. But if they're now, voting for the Russian side, or at least abstaining from our side, and allowing dictators like Bashar al Assad to at least have an audience, I guess we need to keep talking to them. I don't know. I don't really have, a great solution there, but also, from what I've gathered, I just wanted to add this context. I guess one of the reasons why the Emiratis kind of defend what Assad did in Syria is because it's like the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Apparently they feared, according to The Economist, that regime change in Syria would bring Islamists, who they do not like at all, to power. And I understand that. It's kind of a security dilemma here. And, if the Bashar al-Assad regime falls, and you have all these splinter groups of radicals, jihadists, ISIS is one of them, there is a fear that you're going to get a more radical government. And yeah, I guess if you were the Emiratis, you'd be fine with a strongman. Now, again, if they lived inside of Syria and saw what Assad did, maybe they'd vote differently. But again, that's a whole other conversation. And I think this may serve as a valuable warning to all of us. Because, to put this full circle, I think Assad being welcomed back by some countries shows us what happens when he hasn't been held accountable, and there's countries that find him useful and willing to work with because, again, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And I wonder if this could be a lesson on Putin and if we don't hold him accountable, because I worry that just like what's happened with Assad and the UAE last week, there are countries that will find some value or at least need in learning about the positives of what Russia's done in Ukraine and be willing to welcome Putin back into the fold. I think we need to make the price too high. And that's why I would not totally be happy with just partitions and dealing with some of Putin's demands, because I don't think that's what we need here. I really don't.